Elon Musk's lawyers appeared in a Philadelphia court today after the district attorney there sued the billionaire and his super PAC last week. The suit was brought after Musk promised a $1 million giveaway to registered Pennsylvania voters who signed a petition. To break down what we need to know is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, thanks for joining us. Walk us through what happened today at the hearing.
Well, this hearing was supposed to be on the Philadelphia District Attorney, Larry Krasner, his request to block Elon Musk's $1 million daily giveaways. But that all changed after Elon Musk's lawyers last night filed papers trying to move this case out of the state court in Philadelphia and move it to federal court. And that's important because federal law sets out that when a defendant in a civil lawsuit like this tries to do that, until that matter is resolved of whether they can move courts, the state proceedings have to go on hold. So this hearing this morning, the judge got on the bench, heard from the lawyers, and quickly adjourned because he said he just could not continue. So the bottom line is that this lawsuit and the request to block this giveaway is now on hold and is being delayed.
Tactic that we've seen before. There were concerns that this giveaway violated federal election law, though this case doesn't address those claims, but what is this case about?
Yeah, that's right. This is a bit different from what a lot of the talk has been publicly about the legal concerns surrounding this giveaway and whether it violates federal law that prohibits people from paying people to register to vote. Instead, what the DA is doing here is effectively prosecuting it as an illegal lottery. So in Pennsylvania, if you're running a lottery, it has to be approved by the state. There's various regulations. Elon Musk's giveaway is not one of those approved lotteries. And so what the DA is doing here is prosecuting it under Pennsylvania's consumer laws. And like I said, saying that this is effectively an illegal lottery, but really legally speaking, it actually has nothing to do with the fact that the giveaways are related to the election.
The DOJ sent a letter to Musk's PAC outlining concerns over election violations. Has there been any more movement on that?
There hasn't been any more movement on that at this point. As you said, they did send a letter warning Elon Musk. At this point, he has seemed to continue ahead with doing these giveaways, but at least as of this point, we have not seen any further action from the Justice Department. That's not to say that things couldn't change. In theory, they still could, just like the DA here, file some sort of lawsuit against Elon Musk, but here we are 5 days out from the election, and if the concern is that they're concerned about this being illegal and they want to put this on hold, they're simply running out of time now. It's very unclear, even if they were to file a case against Elon Musk, if they would be able to be resolved before next week.
All right, Zach Schonfeld, Hill Legal and Courts reporter. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Drew.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are heading west as the presidential race heads into its final days. Harris is holding rallies today in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Nevada, where she'll speak to supporters in Reno and Las Vegas. Trump will also be in the Las Vegas metro and in Phoenix, with another stop Thursday planned for Albuquerque, New Mexico. Alex Gangitano, White House correspondent here at the Hill, joins us with insight into the campaigns and much more. Alex, over these next few days, are we to expect a continuation of this crisscrossing the country with the candidates going to battleground states and maybe some outliers as well?
Yeah, they're all headed to battleground states. So Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, back to Pennsylvania. That's Harris's schedule. So she'll be hitting every battleground state between this past Wednesday and Saturday, and then double down on some like Pennsylvania. And then we'll have Trump going to Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and he's actually going to Virginia, which is an interesting one, but he's also hitting those key battleground states too.
Do you have any thoughts on why he's going to like New Mexico and Virginia? Those aren't traditional swing states. Is there any strategy to that, or is it just kind of Trump going where he wants to go?
Yeah, well, Trump likes to be able to fill rallies at anywhere, a blue state included, but I also think he'll want to take his message of immigration, wanting to close the border, bringing people out of this country who came here illegally, and if he can bring that to any western state, he'll do it in New Mexico, he'll do it wherever. And then Virginia there's been conversations about non-citizen voting there. I'm sure he'll want to touch on that when he's there too.
I want to ask you about this new CNN poll. It shows Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump by 6 points in Wisconsin, 5 points in Michigan, has the pair tied in Pennsylvania. Those Michigan and Wisconsin polls are certainly outliers. Polling averages basically have it a toss-up in both those states. But looking at the numbers, one of the things I did find interesting is that Harris, at least in this poll, is closing the gap with Trump on Trump's best issue, which is the economy. Do you think that is a sign that Harris is closing this race strong?
Yeah, because it's interesting. When President Biden was at the top of the ticket, the economy was not something he was getting any credit for, even though the Biden administration has done a fairly good job in turning things around, or we should say preventing a recession, which economists thought we would get into. Now she's getting some credit, which is really interesting. I think voters are starting to hear the message of either that she will continue on this path of making things better, or they're getting concerned over Trump's promises for more tariffs, which some economists say could make prices more expensive for Americans. So something is resonating with voters, but that is a very good argument for her in these closing days because, as you mentioned, the economy, as it always has been, is a top issue that Americans go to the ballot box thinking about.
She got some good GDP numbers this week as well. All that being said, whenever people ask me what's going to happen in the election, I basically tell them I don't know, and that's probably a good refrain for all journalists to have at this point. Still, though, we're seeing some finger pointing on both sides, kind of laying the groundwork for maybe a I told you so from both sides heading into this toss-up election. When it comes to Democrats, what are they kind of laying, when you see them laying the groundwork for the finger pointing or the blame game that could happen if Trump wins? What are they saying?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like Democrats, when I talk to them, are so scarred from 2016 when they all were banking on Hillary Clinton winning and former President Trump won. So there are three main things that they're pointing the finger on. One is, should President Biden have dropped out of the race sooner? Should he have waited till July for Harris to get in there and get moving on her own campaign? Also, did Harris message well enough on the economy? I would actually add immigration to that list. I think there'll be a lot of finger pointing on how the Biden campaign has handled the influx of migrants at the border last year. Did they do too little too late? And then lastly, her running mate pick. Would that become something that people blame her on? Should she have went for Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro if she ends up losing? And then, there's maybe people speculating, did Tim Walz really bring her any new voters? We don't know.
One of the things I'm wondering is if there's any second guessing on her ability to differentiate herself from the Biden administration. She was asked those questions early in the campaign and didn't really have a concise answer. Seems like she's been working on that messaging. There's been similar finger pointing going on inside the Republican Party, kind of prepping if Kamala Harris wins this race. You see Trump kind of seeming like he's going to be pointing at RNC chair Michael Whatley. There's also some questions about the ground game in some of these key swing states. What do you think would happen inside the GOP if Trump loses?
Yeah, it's interesting because the ground game has been one of the main things that the Harris campaign points to when they say we have an upper hand on Trump and this is why we think we could win, is because of our ground game, which Republicans are lacking in their ground game operation. I think, first of all, if he were to lose, there'll be a lot of court cases. There'll be a lot of back and forth over the election results, as we saw in 2020. And then I think there'll be a lot of looking at the Republican Party. Would this be a chance, if he were to lose, for some sitting lawmakers to once and for all distance themselves from him and say, okay, you tried again? We're now going to turn the page, as Harris would say, and go for, rising up some other Republican leaders, that the end of the Trump era is over? Or would this continuing, questioning of election results keep everybody in Trump world for longer? We'll have to wait and see what happens.
Donald Trump took questions from reporters yesterday from the passenger seat of a garbage truck. The stunt was meant to highlight this comment that President Biden made where he appeared to call Trump supporters garbage. He later clarified, the Biden people did, that he was talking about a comedian who made a disparaging joke about Puerto Rico. Trump also appeared at a rally wearing this orange and yellow safety vest. I guess the question is is this working? This is obviously a stunt, but do you think it's making an impact?
Yeah, I think they're really trying to keep the focus on this garbage comment from President Biden, and I do think Trump's been successful on that. I mean, Harris was off to a pretty good week after the Madison Square Garden rally on Sunday when the comedian made some pretty racist jokes. All eyes were on the Trump campaign and would the Puerto Rican community in a state like Pennsylvania lose support for him and swing it that way. And then Biden made this comment that suggested that half the population who supports Trump is garbage. And now the Trump campaign is really doubling down on this and saying, you know, we support everybody. Nobody here is garbage. Our supporters are not garbage. And using this to their advantage to kind of flip this script on this one.
I want to ask you about Gen Z voters. There's this Axios Vibes survey that said that half of Gen Z voters have admitted to lying to people that they're close to about who they are voting for. That's double what registered voters across all age groups say about that issue. One wonders, as a result of that, what the Gen Z voters are actually telling pollsters when they call. But when it comes to the youth vote, this has been talked about a lot in this election. What indicators are you looking for on election day that you think could have an impact on the race?
Yeah, the Gen Z vote is so interesting because they obviously, if Gen Z and young Americans and first-time voters go to the polls, they typically tend to side with Democrats, and that could be a good boost for Harris. But they're also not super reliable voters, so they would need to be people that also vote early because on election day, historically, they're not really reliable. But then the whole they often lie about their vote thing is really interesting to me because, you know, are they, they've lived in this super hyper partisan time since they were children. You know, if these people are 18 years old for a decade, they've been living in this really polarized country. And, you know, so at the dinner table, are they telling their parents one thing? Are they telling, you know, is there a gender gap that they're telling their boyfriends or their male friends one thing?
Are they embarrassed to say they vote for Trump, or are they embarrassed to say they vote for Harris?
Right. I don't, like, are they telling their parents that are Gen X that they support Trump when they're really not, or vice versa? I think those numbers in particular will be really interesting to look at after Election Day. And we know the Harris campaign's riding a lot on Gen Z, hopeful that they can help, you know, push them forward if they actually turn out the vote.
Turnout going to be key there. Wanted to ask you about big oil involvement in the presidential race. There was this meeting earlier this year where Trump met with oil industry executives and asked them to raise $1 billion for his campaign, saying that they would more than pay off in tax cuts and deregulation if he were to get in office. It seems like big oil took the cue. What are we learning from some reporting numbers in campaign spending? Yeah,
really good reporting in the Hill today that the $1 billion was not, that is a huge number, that was not quite there, but that some, you know, $25,000, over $600,000, around $50,000. Those were all huge donations from some of these big oil executives. And when Trump made this $1 billion comment, there was, of course, the question over, is this a quid pro quo situation? Like, give me this money and I can do great things for the oil industry. The Trump campaign at the time suggested that it's not that kind of a setup, but the oil industry did come through with these really significant donations. So we'll see if that actually, if he is elected, if that does, you know, influence him.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump is making some explosive and misleading claims about election fraud. He says his campaign caught Lancaster County cheating with 2,600 votes. In reality, the county is reviewing 2,500 suspicious voter registration applications, not votes. He's made similar distortions about York County, also in Pennsylvania. Election officials, are they prepared to combat misinformation, especially in these states that are supposed to be really tight and could determine the outcome of an election?
Yeah, I think after 2020, when so much of that was going around from the Trump side, now election officials have had 4 years to kind of prepare for that, and we have heard that there are preparations in place if something like this happens, but we know the influence of Trump. I mean, he tweeted out that Pennsylvania is cheating, and that's just a way for him to, you know, start to sow these claims of making people concerned about our voting system and maybe think that the election isn't fair, regardless of, you know, which way it goes. So I think he's trying to lay the foundation here, but election officials definitely have their hands full in figuring out how to combat some of this misinformation.
All right, that's all I have for you, Alex Gangitano. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court is considering a handful of election-related cases just days before Election Day. Washington correspondent Maddie Biertemple reports on the legal disputes before November 5th and the ones expected after.
The Supreme Court today is letting Virginia remove roughly 1,600 suspected non-citizens from its voter rolls. A previous court blocked the purge because it's too close to Election Day. The Trump campaign calls the ruling a victory.
The best way to have an election is very simple. Paper ballots, voter ID, proof of citizenship.
Data from states show that cases of non-citizen voting are rare. The White House says
it is already legal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and it is a federal crime that is punishable by prison and fines.
the court is also weighing whether Pennsylvania can count the provisional ballots of voters whose mail-in ballots had problems with them.
The court has to be very careful in how it decides these cases.
Georgetown law professor Neil Sukatme says the court tends to use restraint when it comes to considering cases so close to an election.
The idea is that people have developed reliance on what the rules are, and if you suddenly shake them up, they won't know what the rules are. They won't know exactly what to do.
In other legal challenges, a Pennsylvania judge is extending in-person voting in a suburban Philadelphia county. The Trump campaign had sued, seeking an extension after complaints that people in line to get a mail-in ballot were turned away.
This is a landmark victory that will allow our voters to cast those votes.
Danielle Lang with the Campaign Legal Center says election cycles tend to bring litigation, but she says ultimately
it's going to be Americans, not lawsuits, that decide this election.
In Washington, I'm Maddie Beertemple.
The U.S. is pushing for a ceasefire in Lebanon as senior officials meet with Israel and Hezbollah in the Middle East to negotiate an agreement. The Prime Minister of Lebanon, Naguib Mikati, says he hopes a ceasefire with Israel will be announced in the coming hours or days, though he says he's not optimistic about current peace deal talks, adding the intense Israeli airstrikes have to stop for negotiations to begin. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says any ceasefire agreement must guarantee security for Israel. Meanwhile, Israeli airstrikes have hit the southern Lebanese city of Tyre. French international news outlet AFP has reported the strikes coincided with the arrival of civilians from a Palestinian refugee camp. Israel also carried out strikes earlier in the eastern city of Baalbek. The IDF says it struck Hezbollah targets. At least 2,200 people have been killed in Lebanon and 1.2 million have been displaced in the past 5 weeks, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry. In Gaza, one of the last remaining hospitals in the north was targeted by the Israeli military earlier today. Medicine and medical supplies were destroyed, also damaging a water desalination station and wounding medical personnel. The IDF also carried out raids across the West Bank, killing at least 2 people, including a child. Israel's finance minister is expected to sign a waiver to extend cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian banks for another month after facing pressure from U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. The waiver is essential for Palestinian banks to avoid being cut off from the Israeli financial system. It allows banks in Israel to process payments in Israeli currency for services and salaries tied to the Palestinian Authority without the risk of being charged with money laundering. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.